Welcome to Knowledgeable Aging. I'm your host, Jason Kotar. Joining us today to talk about why funeral pre-planning matters is Dean Lambert. Dean has worked with funeral professionals for nearly 30 years to help them connect and serve the families facing one of the most challenging moments of their lives, the loss of a loved one. As a father who himself experienced the loss of a child, he knows firsthand the grief that clouds vision to honor a life well lived. Dean is leading the Love Always project with a team of experienced subject matter experts and people committed to its purpose, encouraging people to think more positively and proactively about end-of-life issues and funeral pre-arrangement. How are you doing today, Dean?
I am feeling fantastic. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. Thank you for joining us. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So I'd like to get started, Dean.
Sure.
Why does funeral pre-planning matter?
Great question. And the first thing I have to say to that is that it matters to me from a personal standpoint. But all of the stuff that we're going to talk about, I hope, is going to be, well, I know it will be based on years of research. So the first thing, as somebody who's very mission-oriented, what we're doing is that funeral pre-planning doesn't just matter to the businesses that are serving people. They hope will understand the value of pre-planning. But all of the research points to the fact that when somebody prearranges, they believe that they made a smart decision that was the right thing to do for their family. So the most important reason why funeral pre-planning matters is that it matters to consumers that have done it, and it matters to the families left behind.
Yeah.
So it's something that that we also know that there are a lot more people out there who, if they knew about it, would definitely do it. The issue is that lots of folks don't know it's available to them or even how to begin.
So why are people hesitant to have conversations or to even think about funeral pre-planning?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of stigma around thinking about and talking about death, not only in certain cultures where there are some that feel, even if their photograph is taken, that it could bring some, either bad, karma, omen. It could be a cultural thing. But the main thing is that people just don't like to think about their own demise. Usually people, when you ask them when they plan it, when they think it's time to plan a will or to buy insurance or anything like that, to buy a cemetery plot, which a lot of folks think is pre-planning their funeral, which is a small part of it. They do it at a certain age, usually in their mid to late 70s or after some sort of a health scare when they're in senior status. And I don't mean ARPS senior status, which is 55, but usually north of 70.
Right.
And so they typically think that there's an appropriate time to plan for themselves. The problem is they might go out and do it, but they don't tell their kids or their family about it because they're afraid of the response they're going to get. Oh, dad, mom, why'd you go and do that? There's nothing going to happen. And people write it off. The issue with that is that when the time does come to have to plan a funeral, if nothing's written down and nobody knows where it is or they don't know what to do, it creates unbearable pressure at the time of death, not only emotionally, but a lot of times financially.
It's one of those things, Dean, I've noticed in the several years with knowledgeable aging that as a society, we're not really proactive and we're more reactive. And I'm just wondering, especially with your industry, your field, why do you think that is?
Well, I think that people are still in this mode where their initial compulsion when they think about dying is what happens if I die. Even when somebody meets with a financial advisor or plans a will, they're thinking that I'm buying this or I'm doing this in case I die. And we're all going to die. So the life insurance industry and estate planners and financial planners have done a really good job of the in case. And unfortunately, it's not mainstream or comfortable yet to think about when I die. And there, again, are cultures that do accept that they're going to die, and they handle that much differently. In Eastern cultures, you don't see families putting their elders in nursing homes and pushing away that part of life, right? They bring their family in. They live with them. They take care of them all the way through death. And they call it a cradle to grave type of society. In the United States, we don't do that. The funeral parlor, the parlor in the home where the body was laid out, and the undertaker would come and prepare the body, and people would come to the house and they'd black out the windows. That happened in early days of the United States. And as soon as they started building funeral homes and funeral parlors or mortuaries outside of standing businesses, funeral homes and hospitals or hospice organizations were the place where you would migrate to. And the family had a choice of whether to go and visit, spend time, and it was all in the middle of the rest of their, busy lives. And so I think that we're a society that just doesn't understand yet that it's important to be as involved as possible in end of life matters, not just planning, but the process. So it becomes, I don't know, a little bit more comfortable. It's always going to be a kind of gross, icky, uncomfortable, but accustomed, I guess, would be a better word to it, because I think it's important for us to take care of our elderly people and face the end of life so that it promotes a better quality of life after you lose somebody.
Yeah, I want to maybe if you could expound a little bit. You touched on some of the data that shows, how satisfied people may be with their decision for pre-planning. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Dean?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing that is really interesting to find out is we've done studies over the last 15 years. We do a study every other year of people who have prearranged and pre-funded their funerals. And we ask them within a month of doing it a variety of questions to kind of get what their motivators are and how they feel about doing it, the experience and their satisfaction with what they've done. The first thing is that there are people who may think about planning a funeral or planning their end of life, but it takes up to 2 years for somebody to actually do it. And typically that trigger is the death of a family member or friend, or they attend a funeral. Of course, being the right age helps, and if you live in an environment where there are a lot of older folks and, you get in the elevator one day and there's a notification. I'm talking from experience where my grandmother used to live. I mean, every other day there was a notification that somebody had passed, or you see the ambulance come, so it is part of their reality. But, if you're not in that community and your elders live far away, you don't really necessarily may know much until you either get the call that somebody is ill or has fallen or has died. And so what we find out is the trigger is the death of someone close, especially if it's a surprise. And then when we ask them about their satisfaction with prearranging and funding their funerals, there is 0% of people who say they are not happy with their decision to prearrange and pre-funding. 0%. The top 3 boxes are very satisfied, completely satisfied, very satisfied, and fairly well satisfied. And 94% answer the top 2 answers, and 6%. 96% answer in the top 2 box or the top 2 answers, and 4% are fairly well satisfied. Nobody says they're not satisfied. The reasons why people prearrange are that they feel like that it relieved some sort of a burden on a family member and that it was the right thing to do, and whether it's financial or emotional. And I can speak from experience. My father-in-law passed away last February, and there was 0 conflict. I mean, he had he was diagnosed with something rather quickly right after Christmas and passed in February. And his 4 children, among them my wife, and his wife got together at a funeral. Funeral director was perfect. He did everything well. I wasn't involved, but I knew that there was no conflict. I knew that it was a very good planning session. But I did hear that my mother-in-law called my wife, who works in the business that I work in, by the way, she's in funeral homes right now, working with funeral homes today. She when she finally got home and was by herself, and she sort of was just looking through all the paperwork, she had a moment where she said, wow, I didn't realize I spent this much money. And it wasn't, she did not have cognitive dissonance. I mean, she got the second most expensive casket you could buy. Okay. And they were just going through the planning, and it struck them that was a really nice casket that they wanted. And so they bought it. And so her mom told her, I'm not worried. We have the money. It's just I didn't realize. And if I'm a funeral director or a funeral professional of any kind, I would never want somebody to have even a moment of pause, because I want to provide an experience that not only are they satisfied with completely, but that they may talk to their friends about it. So I'd rather, Jill's mom give advice like, well, be really careful about and watch out, because she may say things like that. as opposed to, we were really happy with what we did and how much we spent and all that stuff. So these are things that emphasize to me how important it is to plan in advance and kind of know at least the most of what you want to do, including how much to spend. And people think that those funeral plans are for themselves. It's resounding in the research that they know that the funeral planning, they're doing it for others. They know that they want other people to not have the pressure of trying to decide what they would have wanted or how much money to spend on their funeral. They want to tell their own story, especially boomers want that control.
When you think of, is it safe to say, Dean, that when individuals think of end-of-life planning, that funeral pre-planning is not part of that process? In other words, it's more just making sure my will and making sure my money goes where it's supposed to. Is the funeral part of it sometimes not included, or people are just, maybe it's just a lack of awareness?
I think that's a really good question. For the most part, a lot of folks will buy their plots or their
Yeah.
funeral property, whether they're going to be cremated and they want it to be in a mausoleum or a niche, or whether they want to be buried, or they could have their cremated remains buried. Either way, they feel like that's a quick and easy thing to do. And I think it's because people are a little bit desensitized to the cemetery,
Yeah.
or the
Mhm.
mausoleum.
Yep.
What they don't often see, except for portrayed in the media either as a caricature or a very conflicted time, is the funeral director with the clasped hands, coming in and, licking their chops at at taking advantage of an emotional situation that somebody's in. And that is 99.5% not the case. And I think when it comes time to planning what I would want and what I want people to say, there's a combination of, well, that's it's selfish for me to think that. What do I know what people are going to say about? Why would I tell them what I want them to? Why should I say how I want to be, quote, celebrated or memorialized? That's up to the people at the end. I'm not going to write my own eulogy. And then the other thing is that nobody has taught them how. And when I talk about end of life planning or having end of life discussions, first of all, you have to realize it's going on all the time. Every time somebody prominent passes away, whether it's Queen Elizabeth, whether it's Taylor Hawkins, my favorite drummer from the Foo Fighters, Bob Saget, a famous poet, songwriter, whoever is important in your life that you see on Facebook who passed away or the news. You tend to hear, especially with social media, all of these discussions taking place, yet nobody's really understanding that we are talking about death and dying every single day in a very public way. So how do we focus those discussions and realize that so that we can have those discussions about ourselves before we pass away? And so when I think about talking, when I think about talking about death and end of life, it's not so much talking about death and end of life. You don't have to talk about death to sort of let people know what you want. You talk about your life, your memories. My daughter got married 2 weeks ago, and my toast to them sounded very much like it was all about me, which, if you know me, makes sense. Okay. But I felt it's so important to walk the talk that I talked a lot about the fact that sitting at my table were a group of people who lived on the same block growing up, my father's family and my mother's family. They had not sat at the same table for a meal in 45 to 55 years. And we have relatives that were looking down from heaven, if you believe in that sort of things. Now, in my family, they would have been, I wasn't invited, but it was honestly, if you thought about it, my grandmother, my grandfather, my other grandmother, they were all looking down on this group of people who were sitting together having a street corner reunion that they hadn't done and I talked about that. I talked about how what they're doing today is adding to our tapestry, our family stories, and things like that, instead of just talking about the bride and groom. And I finished with the concept of, why did I talk about this at this wedding? And I talked about this at this wedding because it's important during weddings and birthdays and celebrations while you're alive to talk about those memories so people understand the continuity and have better celebrations when somebody dies. If I hadn't told that story, nobody in that room would know that we lived on the same block. that we were together for the first time in 55 years, that we're talking about memories and things that that are important that might have been missed at my elders' funerals because I didn't take that second during a wedding to talk about, you know, our past and our history and our connections. And so I think when you're talking about this, and what we're trying to do with the Love Always Project is to get people to understand that when you're talking about end of life, whether it's memorializing a movie star or a drummer or a poet or whoever you hear, you are doing it. You're talking about your memories and what was important to you and why they made that connection to you. And you're sharing that with others. Why not do that on a day-to-day basis so that as you go through your life stages and you start thinking about that you want to get some of these things down, it's a lot easier because it's been a topic of conversation before. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, one of the things, just to continue that conversation, Dean, is in you and I talking and doing the research, is a term that I really like, and I hope maybe you can talk a little bit more about it, is normalizing discussions
Mhm.
about what will happen to each of us.
Well, what's interesting, Jason, is that it is somewhat normal now, especially with social media and how quickly we find out that somebody, you know, passed away. Back in the old media days, I'm talking about old, before there were syndicated papers and things like that, people waited months to hear about the death of a family member or even somebody who was prominent. I think Lincoln's death happened pretty quick across the country. There was telegraph and things like that, but now we're hearing things almost in real time. And so it is normalized. It's just not, we're just not accustomed to talking about it in productive ways that help us not only understand the meaning of the person's death, but the importance of or lack of importance in their life. Even bad people throughout history, the people who die who did terrible things, it's important because of how we think about the negative impacts and the positive outcomes of those negative impacts. So, you know, it's commonplace anymore with social media. At the Love Always Project, and hopefully with knowledgeable aging, of course, knowledge is power. That's, you know, your gig, right? To be smarter about what happens to you and what should happen, about taking control of the process of as you pile on the years and how to enjoy them. And one of the ways to enjoy your life as you age and to be less, you know, fearful, having those moments of, my gosh, I'm going to be 60 years old in January. And when people, I started realizing that when folks start talking about 25 years from now, or if my first grandchild is born in a couple of years, when they turn 18, I'm going to be 81, you know? And I'm like, 81, shoot, man, that's, you know, you start thinking in those terms. How much better would we feel about saying that with less trepidation and less fear, understanding that, you know what, as long as I have my health, my kids know, you know, what's important to me, I know what's important to them. And it just makes it, you know, like you said, it's not common, but we're accustomed to it. It's always going to be painful. It's always going to be difficult. It's always going to be a little weird, depending on when it comes up. But if death is a part of life and we know we're going to die, then we can do things for ourselves and our families, not only by living well, but by planning well. And that makes life much better. And it certainly makes the grieving process much easier.
How important is it to be direct when it comes to having these end of life conversations?
Well, I think everybody has a definition of what direct is.
Okay.
And people are very different. You know, I mean, there are folks who are very formal with their parents, father and mother, they may call them instead of pop and ma, you know, and there are different kinds of relationships. So I think people have to um, understand what direct means. And this is the whole world. You know, they say do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, it you only know what you want. So if you do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then you're still doing what you want. It's important to understand how others want to be done unto. And
Hmm.
so I think that direct is a very important word, but it's different in definition depending on your relationship with your parents or other elders. And I think the most direct way you can do it is to understand how to ask the questions. A direct question, like when my father came to the wedding a couple weeks ago, I always learned something new from him, you know, and it's because I take the time to ask questions. Now, I don't ask, he was a decorated military person. He's still working for the Department of Defense, and I know he wants to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. I don't need to ask him questions about his death. What I
Hmm.
need to do is find out a little bit more than I know now about his family, and to see if his preferences have changed by finding a way to ask that doesn't talk about him dying, because he's 82, he doesn't feel well. He knows he's kind of fallen apart. And so I don't want to remind him of that. But my directness with him is to be direct about him helping me understand our family better and him better. That would be a direct way to do it. Now, there are others where you want to talk about to your parents about their money and their final wishes, and sometimes you have that kind of relationship where you can say, "Hey, Dad, Mom, you know, Jill and I we're talking about planning in advance of our funerals. You know, we're in that business, and so you know, I just want to make sure that you know that we've done this, so that you know, God forbid something happens to me on my way to come visit you. I want you to know that here's where things are and here's what's going on. Do you have a plan like that? Is there something, you know, that I should know in case something happens to you?" That would be a way to do it. So I think it's different for everybody else. And the most important thing to do is to take time to think about how you want to have a direct conversation so you get the most productive answers. And again, people love talking about themselves, so make it about them.
Yeah. You know, we've spoken to quite a few people in the advanced directives arena, and I always ask the question, you know, when should you have these conversations? And the responses vary. I know you had mentioned quite a few people when it comes to funeral pre-planning is north of, I believe, 70 is what you said.
Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about the conversations. Somebody watching this or listening to this today, or somebody that's watching or listening to this today, Dean, when should they begin? Is there a time? I know you normalize the conversations, but when do you start to have conversations with a loved one or a series of loved ones about this?
Well, this is a very personal answer. And one thing about being part of the Love Always Project is I don't want to put my personal views or preferences on others. I can
Yep.
only talk about situations. And let me talk about one quick one here. Our son died 6 years ago. He was in the Marines, and he came home after being in Afghanistan, came home a year later, and he's one of the 22 statistics. He died by suicide a year after he came back from Afghanistan. And my wife and I are both in the business, in the funeral business. We don't own funeral homes, but we work with funeral homes to help them communicate about pre-planning and marketing and communications, public relations. And so the first call I made, I believe, was to one of the funeral directors I knew, and then the second call I made was to I ride with the Patriot Guard riders, which we do military funeral escorts. And Adam had done a couple of missions with us, and so I called my Patriot Guard ride captain. That was the second call I made. And I was very aware of I wanted to have that kind of an escort. And those are the two things. I tend to run to crisis, to danger. I can handle that. So we went to the funeral the next day, funeral home the next day to plan the funeral. And the funeral director knew Jill and I both are very familiar with the business and had attended probably 3 times more funerals than anybody normally, just because of our business, right? And so we started planning, and the funeral director took his time, made sure that he was asking the right questions, even though you kind of go off and start telling stories at that point. And funeral directors are trying to capture this down because they know it's stream of consciousness. They know that, especially in our situation, we hadn't thought about his death, you know, and we knew what his some preferences were because the military makes them write a letter, you know, especially before they're deployed. But we got to this part when we were talking about the cars, you know, the funeral coach, things like that. And there's a thing called a Harley hearse. And a Harley hearse is basically something that's towed behind a motorcycle. during a military procession. Now, I had talked to lots of funeral directors about getting a Harley hearse because veterans and law enforcement officers, paramedics, EMTs, they all are very important when those funerals happen. They're media events and things like that. And so I had talked a lot of funeral directors into purchasing a Harley hearse, and they're $100,000 things. Well, you would think that during the planning, when we got to that, I would say, oh yeah, by the way, I called my Patriot Guard ride captain. We're doing that. I need the Harley hearse. That didn't happen. Remember, the second call I made was to the Patriot Guard ride captain. I should have had a picture in my head of me riding with the captain behind the Harley hearse. Nothing.
Mhm.
The funeral director, if he had assumed that Jill and I knew what the heck we wanted and just went through the regular questioning, we would have missed that. And at that moment when he said, now we have the Harley hearse, I assume you want that, right? That's when I had to stop immediately and leave the room. That's when it hit me that he was gone and that I was jacked up in the head, you know, because I'm a crisis guy. I thought I had it handled. Everything was going smooth. When he talked about that Harley hearse and I realized if he didn't ask me about it and I would have missed it, I would have kicked myself for the rest of my life more than I already am. This is why it's important to find a way to have conversations, no matter how old or how young you are, especially if somebody's in the military or in some other place where they're putting themselves in harm's way. That's why it's important. The reason why the age 74 pops up or the middle 70s pops up is because of late retirees. And the other thing is more often than not, a person plans and funds their funeral as part of a Medicaid spend down. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's when you need to go into a nursing home and they take your assets. Well, a funeral plan qualifies as an asset spend down. And so most of the times when people plan a funeral in advance, it's around that age and it's for the Medicaid spend down. And it's a shame because, a lot of times a person will live between 9 and 11 years after they plan a funeral. We're living older, but that's not why you should make all those decisions. It's not just a financial decision. And then what you're doing is you're just picking out all your stuff. You're making a contract between the funeral home and getting, whatever the funding mechanism is, and it's put away and it's done as like your will and everything else. This is a tribute. This is something that you want people to really think about because the ramifications on the grieving process and that first holiday without that person there, if you didn't talk about their life before, think of how hard it is to talk about their life after when they're gone. It's never fun, but it's not as productive to having a quality life with this person in your life in a different way, not physical.
Yeah.
And I know it sounds meta and weird, but it really isn't. If you've got it in place and you know how this tribute's going to be, and you still talk about it, even if you've got a plan in advance, it's still important to make sure that we hope when you're living after you plan your funeral that there's more memories, that there's hobbies. Maybe you've gone into retirement. Maybe you've done a mission trip, and you want that to be part of what people talk about after you die. Taken up a new sport, who knows? But again, it's very important to talk about these things, and it's got to be right for each individual. I say that everybody who has a child should be talking at least between the husband and wife, not just about life insurance in case, but let's start getting things down so our child remembers us at this point in life and moving forward if we happen to pass before they have really formulated about their ideas about who we are. And they can hear it from us and not our aunt or our uncle or their aunt or their uncle or, another person in life.
Yeah.
Tell your own story.
Yeah. Last question, Dean.
Yeah.
A lot of times we talk about when it comes to health and wellness about a care team, who's there helping, whether it's primary care, oncologist, how does that look? When it comes to the funeral pre-planning, what does that team look like? Who's involved and who should be part of these conversations?
Okay. Well, obviously for funeral pre-planning, you should be in charge, especially if you're planning for yourself. If you're planning for a parent, it's really, really important to make sure that brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles know that you're having a conversation with your parent. and that they're open to it, and you don't want to leave them out, because that's just like the conflict that happens, at the time of death. The biggest problem at the time of death in the funeral planning process is somebody saying, Dad would never want that, or Dad told me he wanted this, and you guys are, that's that conflict you don't want. So if you are planning for your parents, or you happen to be living closer and have a discussion with a parent when they're, it just comes up. The thing I would suggest is to make sure that you ask, even if you've got conflict already with brothers and sisters, and say, hey, we should probably involve them. If you're planning when you're, going into retirement, or you just have kids, I think the important thing is that your siblings know that you've planned, or anybody that you want to make sure that your plan is executed to your liking, and somebody who you're in contact enough with that if things change, that it's easy for you to let them know that it's changed. There are also a lot of online, if you want to just Google, end of life planning things. There are a lot of companies. Gosh, I should have written this down. It's a good question. There are companies that allow you to put a lot of your information into secure online places, whether it's passwords, whether it's where your insurance, papers are, or your insurance policies are, and things like that. So you could put them online, and then you can also send those out to people that you want to be in charge. So I would say to involve as many people as you believe would ensure that what you want to happen happens the way it's supposed to.
Yeah.
And again, I wish I could give a more direct answer, but I also want to honor people who think about these things differently, because I don't want to create an artificial barrier for somebody to do this if they say, well, I'm not going to do it because I never talked to my brother anyway, or I'm estranged from my parents.
Mhm.
Everybody's spheres of influence are different. So I think that you need to do it for yourself. It's selfless and selfish.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean. So how can people find you?
Okay, so I am the project manager for the Love Always Project. We have a website, lovealwaysproject.org, which I'm proud to say the best feature of is a community forum. And so one of the things I say is that we have great content creation. I write a lot of blogs and things like that. But if 80% of the content on lovealwaysproject.org was user generated, that would be a blessing. Because then, just what I was talking about, everybody could tell their own stories, ask their own questions, and it's getting people to focus conversations that will help them when they need to make end of life plans or decide they want to make end of life plans. So we're also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Just type in the search Love Always Project or the Love Always Project. You'll find us there. And we're not selling anything. All we want you to do is join the movement, because we believe it's a grassroots movement. It's a bottom up kind of thing. We want people to come in, and you can be voyeuristic and just subscribe to our emails. You can join the forum where you can set up notifications whenever somebody puts something in the forum, and you can participate in the forum as well. So we've got a blog, and again, this is not something, although it is backed by homesteaderslife.com, which is the insurance company that employs me. I also am separate. In that I'm independent, because they want this to rise the entire tide. If enough people talk about funeral planning, anybody who's involved, whether it's a funeral director or somebody who funds prearranged funerals, will benefit from it if people begin to think about pre-planning and end of life planning and grief recovery in different ways. So this is an altruistic project. We have a foundation, Love Always Foundation, that we're just getting started, and we hope that we can get an endowment together that will fund other efforts to normalize and to inform and educate people around end of life planning, so that they are doing knowledgeable aging.
Very good. Well, once again, thank you so much, Dean, for today. As far as Knowledgeable Aging, you can go to knowledgeableaging.com, see all of our upcoming and archived webinars. You can go to YouTube, type in Knowledgeable Aging. We encourage you to subscribe. If podcasts are your thing, you can find us on Apple, Tunes, Spotify, etc. Until next time, I'm your host, Jason Kotar, and this is Knowledgeable Aging.